That's what we are dealing with here. 03444991000. But I can smile now because I am absolutely delighted to welcome here in the studio a very good friend of mine. I've made friends with Adel Darwish, courtesy of our relationship here at Talk Radio, because you were one of my first guests a few years ago.
Absolutely, yeah.
On my weekend show.
Talking about Westminster.
Westminster.
And here we go again. You know, it wasn't Boris at that time.
It wasn't Boris. Who would have believed it? Well, he always denied that he wanted to be Prime Minister, and of course
at
we
that
knew
time, yes,
we knew better.
We knew better, absolutely. Yes.
You know what, Adele? I interviewed Tom Tugendhat MP, who's on the back benches now, and perhaps ideologically he's not quite with Boris, but he's a real talent. He's head of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. And when I asked him, do you want to be leader, he was not really coy. He said, well, you know, if they asked me, yeah, I would. And I think that's how you should answer these things, right?
Well, that is actually going back to the Sir Humphrey's time, and the Westminster it's changed a bit now. Now we have to say, oh, no, I have no ambition whatsoever.
Well, I was quite arrested by Tom's frankness and straightforward. Yeah, I'd do that.
Well, the first knife would be for, dare I say.
Yeah, there's going to have to be a few changes at the top, I think, before Tom gets his chance on the front benches. But we are here to talk about this beautiful book, which I've just been presented with by Adel. It's called, as you can see, Alexandria Adieu. It's a personal history between 1939 and 1960. Adel, thank you very much for this.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm really looking forward to seeing it. And look, if you can just see the picture there, it just shows, doesn't it, that this part of North Africa was essentially more tolerant of Western values, perhaps as we perceive it, than they are now. What has happened in North Africa in the last few years that we have moved away from, you know, a lady sunbathing on what looks like a Spanish resort?
That actually was Stanley Bay. In fact, actually named Stanley Bay,
right,
after Stanley, who was Livingstone, discovered the Upper Nile. And Nile is very important, Egypt. In fact, the areas in Alexandria where the tram stops, it's a chapter in the book about it. One is called Victoria, and one is called Bulkley, and one is called Janakles.
Right.
And tell the story of Alexandria. But this is actually from her own balcony, looking at the beach, and the house there belonged to Alexandrian Armenian family. And that was actually in the late 50s, where girls would actually cross the road if they're living near the plage on their bikinis.
And that's the thing, you know, you see pictures like this from Iran.
Iran
in the
didn't quite have bikinis, but in the 70s they were in short skirts.
Yeah, the women were allowed to be women, and we have
in short skirts.
Yeah,
and that's actually the composition I chose for this picture. Tell the story. And in fact, there's quite a few Muslim saints having mosques near the plages there. And the mosque vicars, the imams, only complaint was that women in their bikini or in their were actually crossing the road while people were praying there.
I see.
So a magazine was launched in 1960 called El Gil, The New Generation, and to sell the magazine, they actually had a competition to design the Islamic maillot. And what the Islamic maillot was?
Okay.
Changing the two pieces into one piece.
Okay.
And the Muslim clergy was actually in the among the judges, and were showing TV clapping their hands for the one piece.
So there is a modesty in Islamic tradition, or at least there was. Because what this book is about, Adel, is essentially there's nothing new in the zoo about culture wars, and what happened in the post-war scenario in North Africa and parts of the Arab world is perhaps something that we are experiencing here, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I would go back to say what happened there. I mean, even the term Arab world wasn't coined at the time in the 1950s. Wasn't even known. I mean, Egyptians never thought of themselves as Arabs because the Arabs for them were Bedouin, and the people currently from the Gulf. They were
the leaders of the Arab world, or they were perceived to be.
That is 1958 onwards, after the Suez War. The Suez War, which is a big chapter in the book here about the complex Anglo-Egyptian relations, with the friendship going back to 100 years, and Colonel Nasser, who was helped by Anthony Eden and the British intelligence in staging the coup in 1952. And I found the documents in the book. But the agreement he made with Eden, he welched back on it. And Suez Canal and the war, and all of that led to this Colonel Nasser Arabization. I mean, there is that chilling quote from George Orwell, 1984. Every book has been rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every street has been renamed, every statue has been removed. This Orwellian change of history we're talking about, now they call themselves Arab, the Arab world, and with that came a new identity. And why I'm bringing cultural war into this, because what we call now political correctness wasn't called then. It was called the reclaiming identity, reclaiming nationality. The Arabization, first called Egyptianization, then it's called Arabization. And the language is the code you reprogram the mind. The mind's a great computer, but you're reprogramming with the language. That's why I have to be very careful with using terms that might look positive, racially positive, but you have to change what's happening to your mind, how you think our identity will change.
It is happening again. I mean, we rush to call people who we would refer to as gay as LGBTQ now, and again, this is happening still in the Middle East as well. The Arab world is actually coming apart. The Shia and Sunni Muslims and their relationship with Israel is coming apart as well, isn't it, Adel?
It's coming apart, and there are some progressive forces happening in this part of the world. And the irony of ironies, the founder of modern Egypt, Muhammad Ali, who actually introduced modernity, Ataturk in Turkey, none of them was actually Democrat or liberal. They imposed the rule of law.
Yes.
They put the church, whether it's the Muslim church or the Coptic and Muslim church in Egypt, in its place, and let secular forces, and the French word laïcité, which is roughly secularism, its place. And what we're seeing now in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, they're not exactly Democrats,
no, but
they are actually putting these reactionary forces in their place, and they see that Israel is not the threat.
No.
The threat to them is actually Iran, Islamic radicalism, and Islamist terrorism. And they see that Israel was just like them, being a victim of that.
We've got so much to talk about. We're going to talk about laïcité in just a moment. There's so much to talk about. I've got to take a break. We've got to pay the bills. But Adel Darwish is here. Stay tuned to TalkTV. Hey, it's Jonny Gould in the chair between now and 7 o'clock. I'm absolutely delighted to have in the studio Adel Darwish, who has written this beautiful... I mean, look how beautiful this book is. Alexandria Adieu. Just in the break, Adel was telling me, Adel's with us in the studio, that it's taken him 5 years to write this one. And essentially, it's about the culture wars which swept North Africa and the Arab world, and that there's nothing new in the zoo, that they reprogrammed words, and that they're telling you different things. Recognise where that comes from. We are starting to see that in this country as well. And, you know, it ties in, Adel, to our last guest about this idea of mass immigration really changing the fabric of our society and emboldening politicians to talk in different ways, politicians being elected, old guys getting kicked out perhaps before their time. We're going to talk about the impact of the French Revolution. We mentioned that word laïcité, which is approximately secularism in France, something that we don't have in this country. We have a different form of secularism here. And something very fascinating, which is that the progressive Arab leaders that are bringing about the change in the Middle East now, we're talking on the Sunni side, the Gulf Arab world, the Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and indeed Sudan, further afield into sub-Saharan Africa, who've signed the Abraham Accords and made peace and normalization with Israel. These guys aren't Democrats.
They aren't Democrats in our definition of democracy. As actually when I was in Egypt before 1952 coup, they were a multi-party parliamentarian system, and the party that would get the majority of seats, the king, would invite them to form the government.
A bit like here.
It was an emulation, although the culture was actually French and the law were French, but it was the presence of the British there, especially Lord of Cromer and from that time, and Kitchener and so on, they evolved that system after...
Yeah, because we got a king, we got better practice than the French. They chopped their heads off of theirs.
We put their heads on stamps and got very proud of that.
Yeah, it's better here, isn't it?
but the system that was there. But when after the coup happened, it actually became the popularism of Colonel Nasser. But in the other parts, like in Saudi Arabia or like in the Gulf, they actually by consensus because it's tribal. The interesting thing, the example I'm making is Ataturk in Turkey, Muhammad Ali, the modern Egypt from 1805 onwards, and he imposed the word laicité. Laicité is not exactly, it's secularism and modernity. All together, and sort of separation of church and separation of institutions and so on. And that's exactly what's actually happening now. Implementing laws, enforcing laws, rule of law, equality. One of the first things Muhammad Ali did, they still had the capital punishment. When a Muslim murdered a Christian, and the judge wanted to pass the death penalty, the Muslim church, Al-Azhar, rejected. He said, no, the life of a non-Muslim is not equal to a Muslim. Muhammad Ali put his foot down and he said, no. And there was a riot. So he sent actually his army to round up the clergy and put them in jail. He said, you are either conform to the law or exiled out of the land. And they conformed to the law. And that's exactly...
So everyone was equal, whether they were Muslim or non-Muslim. Very important.
And in fact, all the constitutions in Egypt before 1924 never named a language or a religion as official. There were 34 different languages, newspapers. There were actually over 40 Jewish publications in Egypt. Only one in Hebrew. But there were actually Yiddish and English and French, and but most were Arabic. And
sad, isn't it? That this doesn't exist anymore.
So, 1924 Constitution named Islam and named Arabic language, and that's beginning of the division. So what's happening now, as we said before the break, when the Gulf leaders like Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, like in Bahrain, like in the Emirates, realize that actually Israel is not a threat to them. It's never been at war with them. It's never attacked them. So they started making peace, because peace is progress. You buy less arms, you build schools, you build hospitals, and so on. And that's actually what makes Egypt backward. And in fact, look at that picture, and look at now women in their veil there. And they realize that unless they actually put that genie that came out of the bottle by the CIA or by our force in the West, in Afghanistan, the so-called Mujahideen, who are Al-Qaeda, who are the Islamic State in another form, you have to put genie back in the bottle. You will never have progress anywhere in the world, and we will be threatened here. And that's what they realized. And it's easier, in fact, to move from a dictator, secular dictator, to modernity and democracy than moving from a theocracy, autocratic theocracy, into a modern state and to democracy, because they will always invoke God, and you can't rebel against God.
No, but there have been some advantages of the clerics who believe in God over the politicians in making peace in the Middle East. So, for example, if you talk to some, as I have, the Shia and Sunni Muslims who believe in the Quran, and they say that there is an argument for Israel in the text of the Quran that is not secular, like the war between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So actually, we are starting to see with the Abraham Accords that it is a religious peace. That's new. Or it's new in this century.
It's a new in this century, but I would rather use the word spiritual. Like, for example, if you look at someone like Rabbi Herschel Kluck, for example, who was a queen gave him a knighthood. He's a great man of peace, a spiritual man. And these are people actually are more spiritual than religious leaders with followers. They are minorities in the region. They have no political followers, but they have spiritual followers. And they understood actually they have a mission as a spiritual leader to invoke peace, love, and tolerance. And that is one of the facets of the long road and long crusade to peace. So that's one part of it. But the larger picture is, as we said, laicity, secularism, liberalism, and modernity. And that's only will come when you have to deal with the extremists.
Yes, indeed. And we're having that battle in this country. Adel, let's talk about you, because you are from North Africa, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm from Alexandria. I was born in
You
Alexandria.
are from Egypt. And
Yes,
this is, it's semi-autobiographical. It's the life and times of Adel Darwish, isn't it, in a way? It is, isn't it? It
is, yeah. Starting from the start of World War II until 1960, the mass exodus. There's between 100 to 200,000 Alexandrians left Alexandria.
Yeah.
And it was the largest sort of Jewish community anywhere, actually, in North Africa.
Wow.
Prosperous there. Many of them were actually against establishing a state for the Jews. They just didn't quite. They didn't think the idea was chic at the time, because they actually had good life, but didn't know about the others somewhere else.
Perhaps a little bit like Jewish people in the United States.
Yes.
Who are a long way from the Jewish state physically and perhaps mentally as well, because of their success in America.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly how they were. But it was actually a different world. And I think the sort of closest one is the Alexandria Quartet. Lawrence Durrell, really, he was. I mean, there's people like E.M. Forster, who wrote Passage to India, and the rehearsal was actually in Alexandria. He wrote the guide to Alexandria. And Cavafy, of course, the great poet of Alexandria. One with the curator, one with the heart and soul. But Durrell is the storyteller. If people wanted to know about life, then read Durrell and his poetry, his poem Alexandria. But that's sort of the life
Yeah, that's it. What you embody, actually, Adel, is something that we seem to have forgotten here, is that the relationship between Britain and Egypt is very strong. I mean, people think of Egypt as an Arab-speaking, a French-speaking nation, but actually it was a colonial hub. It was an important part of the British Empire.
It wasn't actually colonial, never came under colonial office.
No, but it was a pseudo, wasn't it? It was. There
was British presence there as a protectorate, first against the Ottoman Empire, and then again helped the Egyptian to form. It helped the free press in Egypt. Without actually the presence there will be no Aswan Dam. There will be no irrigation program. The Sudan was part of Egypt with its Gordon Pasha, who was actually employed by the Egyptian crown, and the building of the railways and also democratic system there. So it's a 200 years friendship, and so this is very strong history between the two, and it's actually. I think Anthony Eden messed up on two fronts. Churchill advised him not to trust Colonel Nasser. That was Churchill's advice.
He's probably right.
And my grandfather said, I wish he listened. Because for my grandfather and my father, Churchill was the leader of the world, the wisest man in the world, and so on. So that was the generation.
I think he still is as well, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure some of you do too out there, right?
I agree, 100%.
Absolutely. Yeah, you won't get any argument on this show. Can we talk also perhaps about the threat, you just mentioned it briefly, of Islamism here? We have seen, haven't we, this week that a cinema refused to show Lady in Heaven, and a group of Islamists outside chanting God is great at the decision of the cinema not to show it. I mean, that is a threat to our society in a way I think perhaps that you have chronicled in this book as well, right?
It's a threat actually to society, a threat to our values, and I can't remember which TV program I watched it. The young man who made the film, who was sort of British, Kuwaiti, but he comes from a Shia background, and the split in Islam between Shia and Sunni, the two sectors, the Shia pro-Iran. The film is actually being banned in Iran. And a gentleman who's an imam, who's got a PhD in theology, Islamic theology, and he's the head of a center of information, Center of Islam in Oxford. And he was just screaming, he said, shouting. The film producer was very calm. And he said, oh, this is division, this is an insult to Islam, and so on. And they asked him, did you watch the movie? He said no.
He said no. So often the case, isn't it? Anyway, Adel Darwish's beautiful book, Alexandria Adieu, is available now. You can find it on Amazon. It has been an absolute pleasure to catch up. I so wish we had more time. Maybe we will again in the future. Adel Darwish here on TalkTV.